earlier today, I had a chat with our colleague Sana Saeed, media critic and former AJ Plus correspondent. Of course, overnight, we found out who is the new president of the United States of America. I have to ask, how are you feeling today?
I mean, it's a mix of emotions, right? A mix of a lot of different emotions. Obviously, there is this fear and this dread because not only do we now have a new Trump presidency, but we have a complete control of the government. And there's also this sense of, like we were talking about a bit earlier before we started filming, is like, it's also embarrassing, right? This should have been such a easy election for the Democrats to win. Because everything was going wrong for Trump in so many ways. And the Democrats refused to do anything, really, especially once they brought on Harris, once they anointed Harris into the candidacy. They refused to do anything to actually take their reinvigorated base, right? The base that was so done with Biden. They had such an incredible opportunity in that moment that they could have said, we're going to be different. We're going to try. I mean, and I understand that there are practical limitations to basically taking one of the faces of your party and kind of discarding him and being like, we're not going to be him. We're going to be the young, cool, party. Like we're going to be anti-genocide now, but instead of doing that, they not only embraced everything that the Biden administration, and of course, obviously Harris is a part of that, did, but they also embraced the right. And instead of trying to bring in their base, young base, like the future of their base as well, I should say that, the future of their base, they showed contempt, ridicule, scorn, and instead we're going to go pander to this non-existent, Dem-curious conservative in America. And it shows.
Is that where maybe the money is? I mean, ultimately, we're talking about, the US political system is a system that for all, the veneer of a sort of democracy that's exported as a model around the world, although not particularly successfully, is one where money buys candidates, where money is what makes a party win elections. It's one where money buys power. I'm looking at it thinking just the younger generation were not prepared, or maybe just didn't have the means to offer the Democrats the financial backing that they needed, and that ultimately this is a money game, and maybe the kind of deeper interests of the US state were seen to be better protected by Trump. I mean, is this really about gaining younger voters and bringing them back on board? Is it really about voters?
I mean, that's a much deeper conversation regarding the entire nature of American democracy. And of course, the fact that, look, ultimately, in the end, last night, the state that essentially determined it for Donald Trump was one state. Like, how democratic is a system where, out of a country of 325 million people, hundreds of million, over 100 million maybe vote. I don't even know if that's actually, it's probably even less than that, but like millions of people vote. And ultimately, and you have 50 states voting, and ultimately it's only going to be a handful of states that determine who the winner is. Like, how democratic is a system ultimately that way? And of course, we know that money is an inseparable part. It is the quintessential part of American politics. Right? It is something that governs absolutely every policy that is made by the federal government in particular is governed not necessarily as much by ideology as it is also by financial interests of lobby groups and donors and whatnot. Absolutely. I think that should go without saying. That being said, I do think that, another thing also is that Harris raised an incredible amount of money. She raised over $1 billion in an extremely short period of time when she was anointed as the candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination. So, but that money wasn't just coming from massive donors. And, we know that there was a lot of concerns from even Democratic donors about Harris herself. When the conversation kind of started about should Biden be running again or not after his disastrous appearance in the debate against Trump back in late June. So, but that money came as much from donors ultimately as it did from also everyday Americans, including a lot of young Americans, Americans in their 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and up. But I think ultimately, like, the Democrats were like, we got this. They're going to vote for us, right? Like that was the assumption. So that's why they were chasing the money, chasing these non-existent, Dem curious conservatives, because they believed that, oh, our base is always going to be with us because they are worried about their reproductive freedom, right? They were like, women are going to come out because they are worried about their reproductive freedom. They were seeing this they were manufacturing this like brouhaha around Harris. That being said, we also know that there were insiders of the Harris campaign who absolutely were worried that she was not going to win.
Yeah.
Right? That's another thing. It's like even with all the money in the world, that doesn't necessarily determine whether or not you're going to win.
No. Well, you mentioned something very interesting there, which was sort of taking this base for granted. And I wanted to discuss the Dearborn, Michigan case, which of course is an example of the Arab Muslim community in one particular place deciding that they were going to punish the Democrats for the ongoing support for Israel's genocide. And of course, I think not only that, but there was some semblance, at least publicly, of belief that Trump could offer some sort of a solution to the ongoing assault on Gaza and now on Lebanon. I want to ask you whether you think that there is any credence to the hope that has been placed in Trump, not just by that community. I have to be honest with you, for many people outside of America, there was a sort of almost a view on the street that he might be a better option for the Middle East than Kamala would have been.
I mean, Trump is going to be a great option for the Middle East that looks like just the Gulf countries, right? Countries. He's not a great option for Palestinians. He's not a great option for the Lebanese, even though he now, I guess, he does have a Lebanese family member who's been trying to court Arabs and Muslims for the last few weeks. I think there's a lot of misplaced hope with regards to Trump. I don't think we should hold any kind of delusions about who Trump is and what he can do. That being said, I'm also not going to speculate about what he's going to do as soon as he gets into office.
Yeah.
Because I just think it's too early, and I'm going to be more interested in now seeing over the next couple of over November, over December, what his speeches are going to look like. Yeah. He's not surrounded by people who are like, yeah, we want to save Palestinians.
Yeah. Or even a Palestinian state, right? Which I think, yeah. I mean, this is a big thing, right? When people hear, we're going to get this done quickly, which I think was his infamous line on Israel and Palestine. My next line was always, get what done?
Yeah, absolutely. But also, the Israelis have been getting it done quickly in North Gaza for the last 30 days.
Right.
All of this has been happening since October 1st. The Israelis laid a complete siege on North Gaza and have been exterminating the 300,000 people who remain there. And now are claiming, right, literally yesterday, the Israeli military was like, oh, there are no civilians left.
Yeah.
Right? Unreal. There are no civilians, which is, of course, false. Yeah. So essentially saying that everyone left is a quote-unquote terrorist. And they are exterminating. And we don't know the full extent of the extermination because of how little information is able to get out. There are very few journalists who are in North Gaza, and there's a communications blackout. It's very hard for them to get internet access. And they keep telling us, right, people like Hossam Shabbat, Anas al-Sharif, like they're telling us, hey, what you're seeing and what you're able to get about North Gaza is like 1% of what we are experiencing. Even last night, right, as these election results are coming in, the Israelis were mercilessly bombing Beit Lahia.
Yeah,
So this is like, to me, when whatever Trump does with regards to Palestine, the Middle East, um, we have to also remember that there is a new baseline that's been created
absolutely.
for violence and for genocide. And that baseline was created by the Biden and Harris administration. And the reason why I also I'm not out here being like, oh, I'm hopeful for I mean, look, we can say like, again, I don't want to speculate, but again, like, sure, like, I understand like people being like, well, maybe he's like, he does have some good relationships with those Gulf guys, and maybe the Gulf monarchs will be like, hey, my guy, like, rein it in a little bit. You're like this, your country is doing way too much. Let's rein it in. He's not as ideologically tied to Israel the way we know Biden was. Biden called himself an avowed Zionist.
Right.
Blinken, right, is an avowed Zionist. So, and there are all these people who are very much so invested and vested in a very specific type of project of Israel. So, sure, I get that there are people who are like, well, maybe because of like maybe there's a slight chance that the policy could look somewhat different. But ultimately, I think we have to look at that it doesn't, to an extent, it doesn't matter who the face of the government is as well, because this is all about how power structures work,
Right.
right? American warfare is not driven only by one individual. It is driven by an entire structure, which includes, of course, what is referred to as the military-industrial complex, what weapons manufacturers' interests are as well, which comes to the point, as you were mentioning earlier, about the role of money in all of this. There is a lot of money to be made in the shredding of the bodies of children. There's a lot of that money to be made.
Absolutely.
And we know that even so many of these countries that are like, oh my God, stop the genocide in Gaza, are the same countries that then go and say, we want those weapons that Israel is using.
Mm-hmm.
Those weapons. We want that surveillance because they want to use it to suppress movements and opposition in their own countries as well.
Oh, you
right?
wouldn't be referring to the UAE or Saudi, of course.
No, of course not.
Sana, I want to ask you about this election, like a step back now at, the themes of the election and the extent to which you feel that the key issues that Americans are actually facing, from climate crisis, healthcare, gun control, fiscal instability, like, do you sometimes feel like there are issues that you have been allowed to debate as an American voter, and then there's a whole array of other issues that for some reason you're just not even allowed to discuss as political questions?
I mean, so those two separate questions there. One was about, if I remember correctly, is about like, do I feel that significant issues that impact Americans were they kind of brought up in this election cycle?
Yeah, as in, to the extent to which this election cycle almost gave you a choice of what was allowed to be debated, and some issues were beyond the political debate.
I would say most issues were beyond political debate, because as soon as Harris was especially anointed into the candidacy, it became about quote unquote democracy and reproductive freedom. And nothing else seemed to really be something that we could talk about and ask about with regards to policy. And I think that is ultimately that is a disastrous undertaking by the Democrats, an unsurprising one, because all they thought they could recreate some Obama moment, right? Which is really what they were doing. They were manufacturing this very transparent Obama moment for Harris, which was not going to work. It was obvious that it was ultimately a house of cards that they were creating. But, one thing I keep thinking about since last night is that, and Harris at one point, right, acknowledges this about, I mean, in the worst way possible, because she talks about the price of, what was it, like bread, right? But then she's like, Americans, I guess, have to choose between a genocide and bread, is like,
oh my gosh,
essentially framed it. It was a very bizarre framing. But my point is that, yes, Americans, the average American is deeply, deeply hurting economically and financially. And for the Democrats, for the Harris campaign to embrace and celebrate the rich and famous as their means of being like, oh my God, your girl Beyonce, your girl Taylor Swift, they're coming out for 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 Kamala Harris, and so should you. How is that going to be? And again, it shows this huge disconnect between the Democrats and who they think is in this country, right? Whereas, one of the things that the Trump campaign did do is that they were also looking at like, oh, you are clearly, yeah, you're marginalizing people that you should easily have, which is why in the last few weeks we see the Trump campaign take on this very, I don't want to say anti-war rhetoric, but that is how it's being described, but this much more like, yeah, we're gonna fix the situation. I mean, it's very vague, right? And when Trump is like, we're gonna end the war, and then he's like in Lebanon, I'm like, okay, well, there's also a genocide happening. What about that, right? And the thing is that a lot of voters oftentimes are just looking for a bone.
Right.
And the Democrats, instead of giving so many voters just a bit of a bone, just kick the plate away instead.
Right.
And that's the thing. So we didn't talk. I don't. If you were to ask me, and I consider myself very well read on the issues, but if you were to ask me off the top of my head, what were Harris's positions on everything from climate to gun control, I couldn't tell you that what it was that she was offering that was unique. And also we know from the DNC is that they got rid of a lot of progressive policies that we know have such incredible support amongst the American electorate, which is why in at least 2 states last night, if I'm not mistaken, I haven't checked all the numbers this morning, but in at least 2 states last night, increased minimum wage, so $15 minimum wage passed.
Wow.
Right? These are the issues that Americans really care about, and the Democrats could not even pretend to say, yes, we recognize this, here's the plan, A, B, C, D. Instead, it was all about, we're not going back.
Yeah.
So, well, thanks to you guys, I don't know what going back is, but we're definitely not going forward either in any good capacity.
Well, on that very subject, and this is my final question to you, Sana, the Economist's Democracy Index now ranks the US as a flawed democracy rather than a full democracy. And we obviously see creeping authoritarianism across the world. You talked about surveillance technologies tested in some parts of the world being acquired by democracies, by so-called open societies to increasingly control their populations. How do you feel, as things stand today, with 4 years of a Trump administration ahead of you, about the state of US democracy and the implications of that for the rest of the world?
We need to look at this moment in a very long trajectory of a global shift to the right. We have seen this happen not only in Western European nations, not only in the United States, not only in Canada, where, by the way, we're probably going to have a far-right prime minister next year, but we've seen this also happen in other countries, biggest one being India, right? And since 2014, and well, prior to 2014, but especially since the election of Modi. So we've seen a huge shift globally towards, and by the way, all the rhetoric is the same, right? It's protect our borders, it's anti-immigrant, and of course all these are tied to also it being anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-poor, right? It's people who are seen as undesirable, and there's a through line for the last, I mean, not even just last 20 years, it goes prior to that, but especially in the last, there's a through line for all of this. And it is something that is global. It is not something unique to the United States, but the United States is, of course, the greatest purveyor of violence in this world. It is also the greatest purveyor of influence, of ideology, of culture. So it's only a matter of time that the United States would reflect exactly the other things that have been happening, the other movements that have been happening to the right elsewhere in the world. So to me, this is not necessarily, this moment was avoidable, but even that avoidance would have been a Band-Aid. It would have been a Band-Aid.
Yeah.
And I don't think a lot of people, including those who support, right, the GOP, are entirely ready for the world that's been forged in the last 20 years that we're about to see really, and not exclusively in the last 20 years, but especially since the war on terror, begins, and kind of how much of an ideological impact that has, the impact it has on weapons and surveillance and all these things. But also the impact the last 13 months have had. I haven't in a very long time put much stock into international law. But the fact that whatever facade remained, whatever kind of moral appeal maybe remained of international law, has been completely eviscerated by a Democratic presidency administration, is something that should absolutely be terrifying all of us, as we now see this country, which again, the greatest purveyor of violence, or the greatest military and all these things, has someone like Trump at its helm again.
Yeah.
And someone who it doesn't have fears about re-election. That's a whole other conversation, right? It's like this is his technically his final term. So and you have a very empowered, unencumbered GOP that is feeling really, really, really good right now. Very, very good. And other far-right movements around the world, other conservative movements that are, again, anti-immigrant, anti-Arab, Muslim, anti-poor, all these things, are looking at this and saying, yeah, that's what works. And I want to also mention is that the Democrats did the same, right? The Democrats also embrace a lot of like right-wing rhetoric and policies. When Harris and Trump had their debate, and Trump was saying all these horrible things about, about people coming across the border, about immigrants, about asylum seekers, Harris didn't disagree with those things. The things that she disagreed with, and what the Democrats then later latched onto after the debate and condemned him for, were the horribly racist and, of course, like false things he said about Haitian Americans, about Haitian immigrants in this country. But they didn't disagree with all the other like horrifically racist things that were being said about other people who were coming across the border. And like the fact that also Harris is like, yeah, let's build that wall. And the fact that they think that is the position that people want, which this voted on and said, yeah, we do.
Yeah.
So.
Well, Sana, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. I don't know what I could say. I wish you the best of luck, because I think you guys might need it. Maybe we all need it.
We all need it. We all need it.
Thanks,
Thank
Sana.
You so much.